Iowa because Alan said that he knew all about Iowa, and he would go to Nebraska and he would meet younger boys at runaway centers and bring them to Chicago and gay centers. And I just know that he was from Iowa. He was introduced to me by Leslie and Alan. He had come over to Alan's house one night, and he immediately liked me. But then after I turned, and that was another one that I was told by others that, oh, you know, Lance likes him very, very, very young. You're too old for him.
At 12 or 13?
13, yeah, no, when I got 14, 15, at 15, 14, forget it. 14 was the last time I actually did something to Lance because I was getting too old for him.
Do you recall what the age of the youngest boys that you would have seen were?
I would say maybe 11, 12. I never saw extremely young boys, but I do recall a guy by the name of David Martin who would bring binders of young boys that were 6, 7, 8 years old. Black binders, and they would go through them. And Leslie would even come out and say that he wasn't interested in boys that young, and Alan would say that too. But yet, they wanted, at the time, boys under 15.
Under 15, over 11 years old.
What I noticed too, okay, there was like a group, and like when I talk about trafficking in a network, like, I mean, this is trafficking. When I was 14, I was introduced to John DuPont, who was a friend of all of theirs. And what was odd is that John was obsessed with having doctors around, and he knew all the doctors from Villanova University and other universities. Now, like I said this to you before, I never ever came in contact with the doctor from Ohio State University. But at the same time, John DuPont knew all the doctors at the different colleges and even the high schools. And John would verbally, I remember Jay Eldridge, who was a doctor, that besides being a cardiologist, he was also a doctor at a grade school, and it would go into the grade school in New Jersey like once a week to meet with boys at a grade school. So it's odd that there was sort of a connection, when you think about it, to Leslie Wexner, the doctor at Ohio State University. Now Wexner says he knows nothing, but the guy from Ohio State University, the doctor, lived in Chicago at the same time everything was going on in Chicago.
Yeah.
So it's odd that, and then you had John DuPont, who was obsessed with like bodies and genetics and steroids at the time, and experimenting with steroids with young boys.
I have a question regarding Donald Trump with the films, the snuff films.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall any of them ever talking about Donald Trump's snuff film addiction or involvement in the producing of snuff films or distribution at all? Never. I mean, never once. The only time as far as Donald Trump, I always looked at Donald Trump. Everyone wanted to be Donald Trump during the late 80s. I mean, Trump was everywhere. I mean, I remember walking everywhere throughout New York, and he was always on the front cover of the Daily News of the New York Post. So everyone looked up to Donald Trump, and they wanted to be Donald Trump at the time. So I never recall them even talking about Trump. and what he was involved in.
I've spoken to another survivor whose recollections of Trump are from the early 1970s. And he's mentioned in the Epstein documents, the 1222 Epstein documents.
Okay.
One of the limousine driver, there's an FBI incident report, and I'm vetting and verifying some of the incidents, but he said that when he was in the limousine, that Trump had asked him, "Do you remember me?" And he said no, and that Trump had said to him, "You were my first boy." And he doesn't remember getting sexually assaulted by Trump, but he does have memory of an incident, at least one incident involving Trump during 1971, 1972.
I just remember when you said boy, that's what they always called us. They would say boys, boys, the boys. We have to get boys over here. We have to meet more boys. And another thing that they did too, they placed ads in the Gay Chicago magazine, and they placed ads in the Chicago Reader. It was like as if they had one person that handled those boys that they met through the newspaper advertisements. There was one guy who eventually handled just that, bringing those boys in. They were very well organized because they had different guys that either worked for Leslie or Alan that handled different areas. Like you had one guy who handled the flight bar and the bus stops and the train stations. And the way that the Greyhound train bus station was set up in Chicago at the time, I'll never forget it, because I actually went there one night when I was approximately, I would say 13 to 14. I don't know exactly the age, but between 13 and 14 with David Gailey. And I remember going into this bathroom that had a long row of urinals and stalls and then showers. And there were so many young kids in there taking showers, you would actually pay to take a shower. And this was back in maybe 1980, 81. David would actually pick the young guys up at the train stations and the bus stations. So he was in charge of that area. One was in charge of the area with the ads. Even though they didn't like Lance, and they kept talking about how you couldn't trust Lance, be careful what you tell Lance. Lance was still working with them as far as going to Nebraska and Iowa. And then you had another guy who was a Spanish guy who actually dealt with San Diego. They went to San Diego a lot because of the border. And they would always talk about how they had certain times and certain border individuals where they could walk across the border into San Diego. And then Leslie Wexner's antique dealer would actually allow these guys to stay at his home that he had in San Diego. Lincoln Higgy had an antique shop in Chicago, and he owned real estate with Leslie and Alan in Chicago, but he had a house in San Diego, and he would actually meet Mexican boys that he would send to Chicago. Now, Leslie and Alan had a falling out with Lincoln Higgy because Lincoln wanted a loan to buy real estate, and Leslie and Alan refused at one point to give him the loan. So there was an issue with that.
I'm just scribbling a bit. Research related.
And then, it was at the time, when I look back on it all, I mean, it was almost unbelievable because, like I said to you the other day, the amount that went on in one day, it's so hard to believe, to think that they only slept a few hours. By 6 a.m., they were up and out. I mean, it was as if they hit the streets and it was nonstop. I remember one day getting up, going for breakfast, going to Chinatown where they had a warehouse of antiques, where they actually had tunnels under the ground going to the buildings across the street in Chinatown, where they had antiques hidden under the ground. It was like a vault. And from going to Chinatown, then we would go to the Art Institute and meet with people. They were always wheeling and dealing with individuals at the Art Institute in Chicago with pieces of artwork. Then they were sending artwork throughout the world. And what's strange, though, is with Lincoln Higgy is the one that they wanted me to travel with and go to his home for the first time. It was like the first time I was getting ready to leave Chicago. I was very young and I refused to go. I turned down at the last minute and they had gotten furious with me. But when I think of the antiques, they even had warehouses in Ohio of antiques. And they were so excited to talk about how they were able to get a lot of the antiques from the raids, FBI raids. And they had first bids on all the antiques. It got to the point where there was an insurance guy, and I don't remember his name, a very, very wealthy insurance guy in Chicago who owned an insurance firm. And then there was another guy who owned, it was like a savings and loan at the time. And I remember them talking about pieces of artwork that they wanted from this guy. And I remember Lance saying, well, you see how they were able to get that artwork, don't you? The guy is in prison now under false charges. And I'm like, at the time, I didn't know what was going on. I mean, I just listened to Lance, and Lance knew what was going on. But just the fact that they wanted artwork from these individuals, and eventually the individuals ended up in prison.
How much did they talk about the FBI?
Nonstop. They controlled everything, and they wanted you to know that they controlled everything. They wanted you to know that they controlled the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, which they verbalized. And at one point, I was called in for questioning, and I remember I was 14. And I lied about my age when they called me in, and I'm sitting at the Cook County with attorneys from Cook County, and I'm going into detail about everything. And at the time, they tried accusing me of something that Alan had said I did, which was not the case, but they called me in to talk to me about Alan. And when I looked back on it all, I realized that that attorney was a friend of one of his nieces. So they were constantly talking about how they controlled everything in Chicago. Lance Durfee, there was a guy who jumped off the balcony who everyone said Alan killed him. And there's police reports regarding the jumping. And I remember Alan said, oh, nothing's happening to him ever. I'm not Alan, but Lance would say, oh, nothing's happening to him. They control the medical examiner's office. So they wanted you to know that they controlled everything. Now, I have no idea if they truly, truly controlled everything. But when I look back on it all now and I'm able to Google different people, I realized that, wait, the individuals that were coming to Alan's home were extremely powerful, and they were running the city of Chicago.
With the FBI, were they talking about, bureaus in Chicago, or did they allude to any other offices?
They talked about the FBI raids when it came to artwork.
Okay.
And how that they had first bids on artwork through the FBI raids and through the FBI. They would always talk about, oh, once the FBI raids that place, we'll have first bids on that artwork. And the amount of artwork that they had warehouses
Yeah.
of paintings, of sculptures, of everything you can think of. I mean, we're talking warehouses. And they were obsessed with antiques. They were obsessed with artwork.
Did they ever talk about Ray Cohn? I mean,
No.
Roy Cohn?
Roy Cohn, no. Mm-mm. No. Nope.
It's interesting that, you know, Cohn was so active in the Jewish mafia in New York, and so was Trump, and some
Well-
Italian mafia, and it's interesting that there wasn't any mention at all of some of those
Okay,
individuals.
what people don't realize is Chicago is like a little secretive place. And even to this day, okay, people don't realize how much comes out of Chicago. If you research and just research as far as the individuals from Chicago, it's unbelievable. Okay? And the power that the individuals from Chicago have. And this goes back to the 70s. Majority of all of your major, powerful Jewish families are out of Chicago. And it's like a secretive little place. Whenever I go back to Chicago, I realize that it's almost like it's a very secretive place where not many people realize that so many individuals are from Chicago. I mean, especially, like for instance, everyone that was involved with Obama at the time, even though that was later on, but even during the 70s and 80s, I mean, if you look at individuals that are running Hollywood that are actually from Chicago, the Podesta, I mean, so many people.
I want to speak a little bit about the boys that you would see that were runaways, that came from backgrounds socioeconomically poor. What did they?
Okay.
What did Alan and Leslie talk about the boys? How did they present to you where those boys
Okay.
came from, where they went? Did they ignore? Did they talk? What was their presentation?
Oh, no. They were always presenting them that they were actually helping them and they were concerned, but yet they were also training them to almost become sex slaves, if that's what you want to call it.
Mm-hmm.
And they started using me and other boys to encourage the other ones to stay, and that Alan was going to take them shopping, Leslie was going to take them shopping. Don't worry, you're going to be able to stay in one of the apartments with the other guys.
Mm-hmm.
So there was always, and like I said, there was competition. They always wanted a little competition among us where they would compare our bodies. But yet there was it was all about like manipulating them through buying them things.
Mm-hmm.
And that they wanted to send them to school. They were they would make them believe that they were going to make sure that they were sent to school. What about like going to the Art Institute? Would you like to take photography classes? They always wanted to like transform the boys into something. But yet a lot of them, you could tell they were from extremely, extremely poor backgrounds. And then Alan and Leslie would actually verbalize that they were white trash, so don't worry about them. So, I mean, they were very negative toward the boys that you could tell that were from extremely poor environments. And a lot of them, the boys, they were so worried about a place to sleep that they would sit there at Alan's house, and then Alan would have someone come and get them and say that oh, you're going to go to Hal's house tonight so that you have a place to sleep. Or I'm going to call the YMCA, you're going to the YMCA. Or I'm sending you to the Abbott Hotel for a month. I'm paying for your room at the Abbott Hotel, which was on Belmont at the time. So they had hotels in the Y and a few other hotels where they would send the boys if they really needed a place to stay, if they didn't have like a daddy to take care of them, which we called the older guys daddies.
And the average length of time you would see some of those boys before disappeared? Several months? How long?
Some, I mean, they would live with other guys, so they would still come over with the other guy.
Mm-hmm.
But I would see them mainly a few months before they would just totally disappear. And then they would I would come out and say, oh, so what happened to Daniel? Oh, Daniel, he went to the flight and evidently some John killed him. Or, what happened to Daniel? Oh, Daniel got hit by a car. Or they would make something up. But Daniel could have been living with one of their friends too. But they lied so much, and they would always laugh, so you just would go along with whatever they would tell you. And because of your age, you believe them. Like, I don't remember questioning them that much.
What would you estimate is
and I would be glad the boy was gone. Because I felt like I was put on a pedestal then. I know it sounds selfish, but I was very young at the time. But I do remember at the time, if they brought someone in, like I remember one young kid, I felt like there was competition. And I was just hoping that the young boy would leave.
What would you estimate the turnover was of the young boys, the total number of boys that you met and that after some period of time disappeared?
Hundreds.
Hundreds?
I mean, there's no words to describe it. It's like when I think of their sexual, appetite, I mean, they would have contests and talk about how many they had. They would keep track of how many young boys they had sex with. And they would actually keep track and write it down. Like, I remember at one point, Harold Simon coming out and saying, oh, I'm on my 460th boy this year. Peter Piccios was the same way. Peter would verbalize how many he had that year, and he would count. And they would keep track.
And would you estimate that most of the boys were runaways or kidnapped victims? Kidnapped victims that were either runaways, they kidnapped, or they lured from other locations.
They wanted runaways. They wanted kids that had no parents. They wanted kids that were runaways. And that's one of the reasons with me, because I had a base in Chicago, they were a little leery of me because I was close to my family. But they wanted to try to separate me from my family by talking about how horrible my family members were. But there were hundreds of boys, and there were so many, throughout the years. And I remember, every day was an event. And they did not want, they did not want those boys around for a long period of time. I remember going to, the mafia party, which was the worst of the worst. Those boys, sometimes, I remember seeing some of the boys there that were having sex with Harold, and then they would talk about different guys that they had had sex with, and they would disappear. So it was just a horrible. And then another thing too, it was like an event. The parties were like an event. They organized these parties. Everyone was as if, and they used, a lot of times they used different names as well. So Alan had aliases that he went under that I don't even remember. Leslie Wexner had multiple aliases that he went under. And then later on in life, I mean, even with me, I started like following as far as like me just making up a name. I did the same thing they did because I thought it was natural when I was like 18. Because they did it all the time. They would make up names. And then, yeah, they did that a lot. And then even when they went to the parties, a lot of them would use their aliases when they were walking around the party. They came up with different names to go along with the scene that they were playing at the parties. So they like recreated themselves for that scene at that party.
And how often do you remember during those years? How many times a year were they hosting and attending the parties?
Okay, the parties were nonstop. They had the parties whenever there was a long weekend. Some of they called it their playroom, and they were proud to show off their playroom. And that's what they called their like sex area. They called it their playroom. So if Bill Peclo had a mafia party, say a long weekend for adults, this guy by the name, I forgot his last name. I know that his last name was, I know his last name, I forgot his first name. His last name was Holland, and they had a mansion in like almost like a mini farm in Highland Park. And I just never forget because they had a maid's house. The house was unbelievable. This is the home where it was the first kosher kitchen I ever saw. And this is where they had the walk-in safe in the basement that was a jail cell if they lock you in. And he would have parties the same weekends, but for underage boys. So one weekend they may have two parties, and this was in Chicago. And if you research the Mafia Party, it was turned into a non-profit, which I think is on Wikipedia, and it shows it was founded in Chicago, and then it went international or national. And it's still going, but now it's a very organized group of men that are into things like that. But now what I noticed all over their brochures and everything that I've been able to pull off after people have sent me information, it says 21 plus. But during the time of the 70s and the early 80s, when Leslie Wexner and Alan Kramer were behind it all, it was older and young boys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I recall advertisements on the mafia parties during the 1990s when I was living in Northern California.
Okay. And it was founded in Chicago, I found out not that long ago. And the FBI, they tried convincing me. When I first went and mentioned everything to the FBI, and I mentioned everything to the United States Postal Service and attorneys with the government, they told me I was crazy. There was no such thing as a mafia party. They told me that I was delusional and that I was making everything up. There's no such thing in Chicago as a mafia party, and that the FBI's Chicago office had researched and investigated everything. And this is back in the 80s. They told me that. And then later on, I was able to find documents pertaining to the mafia party being incorporated or turned into a nonprofit in Chicago during the late 70s when everything was happening in Chicago. And then, like I said in the past, also, whatever happened in Chicago during the early 80s,
everyone left. And even what I noticed recently, I think I sent you the list of the pieces of artwork that Alan had in the collection that I was finally able to locate, which you read. He dismantled his collection quickly. I remember. It's like he said, I only have a couple of months to do this. I have to get out of here. And whatever they were running from something, but I don't know for sure. I don't know if it was the fact that Lance and I, mainly Lance, turned them into the Mexican embassy.
What was the year
maybe,
again that you talked to the Mexican embassy?
I would say 84, 85. 84 maybe. It's hard for me to remember the exact time, but the Mexican embassy would have all the documents on Alan Kramer, I know for sure, and on Leslie Wexner. And I did recently contact them too.
Okay.
And whatever happened during that period, they just, I mean, we're talking within less than a year, everyone was gone. And maybe that's one of the reasons why Hulu and all of your major news outlets in the mainstream media refuses to investigate Leslie Wexner's Chicago years. They're covering up for something. Even his interior decorator's daughter-in-law said they're definitely covering up something major. And even Mrs. Florsheim, Lillian Florsheim, she knew about Leslie when she warned me about him and told me that he was a pervert and to stay away from him. And they were all involved in a Jewish-only apparel union. Mrs. Florsheim's family because of the Florsheim Shoe Company, Leslie Wexner and Alan Kramer because of their clothing companies. They were all involved in the same apparel union that was for Jews only. And everything that they did, they were all involved with like Jewish groups, Jewish unions, Jewish country clubs. And then we were the outsiders. And even like I remember when they would go to a well-known synagogue on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, they made it very clear that I could not even sit in the lobby, but at one point I had mentioned to you it was so cold out, and Alan had left me in the car, and I had to go in and sit in the lobby, and the guy didn't want to let me sit in the lobby, but I said it's too cold for me to sit out here when Alan and them were meeting with Israeli officials at the synagogue. And like I said, they meet throughout the night. At any time Alan got a call, he would have to go, and any time Leslie received a phone call at the apartment, because they didn't have cell phones or anything, they would have to go.
Did they ever talk about the individuals, the Israeli officials that they met? Did they ever mention any of their so-called names? Was there, how did they present?
They knew everyone. They would always talk about prime ministers of Israel that would actually secretly fly into Chicago. Chicago was a hub, and not many people realize it. There was so much secretly going on in Chicago. And I mean, if you just start researching even individuals that are out there now that are from Chicago was a major hub. And there were always officials flying to Chicago, and they were always putting them up like at the Hilton Hotel on Michigan Avenue, I remember. They had hotels on North Michigan Avenue. They would stay at Alan's houses in the suburbs. They would stay at Leslie Wexner's apartments, which very rarely would he ever let anyone in. Even when Leslie would fly to Chicago, a lot of times, like I had said, he would stay in hotels, even though he had 2 apartments at one point that I remember. So they were always meeting. And another thing, too, I was so young, I didn't even know who these people were. And Lance would say,
to me because he would speak very loudly, and he would go, "Oh, honey, do you know who you're sitting with? That's Charles Levy from Levy Magazine Distribution." And he'd talk very loud, and then he would say, "Oh, do you know who that is? That's Renee Crown from the Crown family." And I'm like, "Who's that?" I didn't know who they were. And these are the people that backed politicians and put them in power at the time. The Pritzkers, and everyone knows that the Pritzkers were in the Epstein files and the governor of Illinois, but his relatives were always with Leslie and Allen. And the Pritzkers, whenever they would have dinner, they made it very clear that they did not want any non-Jews at the dinner table. So we could never go to wherever they were having the dinner party at, the apartments that they were having dinner parties at. I would have to leave and go to one of their friends' home to stay. And then I was always wondering what was going on in the back of my mind, but they would never tell me.
And how did Alan introduce you to the individuals that you met?
He had no issues introducing me to people, and no one questioned. Alan never said I was his son. John DuPont always told people that I was his son, but no, Alan never gave an explanation. But I remember Alan's family members. Okay, Alan's brother's wife. Okay, Izzy Roeder was her father, and I think it was Claire. I forgot. I think the name was Claire, but I remember them coming over one evening, and she was making fun of me because I was not Jewish. And I just remember her coming out and saying, "Oh, Alan likes them young. He likes the Goyams young." And she started laughing in this loud laugh. But then recently I researched them, and there's a fund at UCLA in LA where they're funding students to go to Israel that they've backed. Scholarships that they pay for. And that was Alan Kramer's brother's wife's family members, and they were extremely racist, and they knew about Alan. She said, "Oh, Alan likes him young." And Mrs. Florsheim knew about it too. She made it very clear that they liked them young.
And they never said anything other than those sorts of statements? They just behaved as if...
It was no big deal. They didn't care. And the reason why I think they felt that way is because we were non-Jews, so therefore in their mind we were meaningless in their eyes. That's how when I look back on it all, and I don't want to sound, I don't want to sound like as if I'm racist or anti-Semitic, but that's how they actually made us feel. That because we were not Jewish, we did not count, as if we were non-human. And I remember Virginia saying the same thing about Ghislaine and Jeffrey. And Maria said the same thing.
Well, there's a lot of racists. So, I've met Caucasians that are racist. I've met Africans and African Americans that are brown-skinned that are racist. I've met folks that practice Judaism that are racist. I've met, individuals of Aboriginal background that are racist, and I've met lots of folks that aren't racist. So it's unfortunate that you had such grotesque experiences with extremely racist individuals.
And my Jewish friends that I talked to, and I've talked to them about what had taken place, they agree with everything that I have said. And a lot of them have actually acknowledged that relatives of theirs feel the same way about non-Jews. So,
different, a different sort of bigoted focus,
and
but the Trump Dixie Mafia, there's a lot of racism towards individuals that are African American, brown skinned, and the socioeconomic bigotry was quite specific. So, part and parcel, racists flock together, I find, even when they're usually racist against each other.
Yes, and what mainly, as far as the Chicago years, and there's so much that has happened, I try to put everything in a compartment. And the Chicago years, as far as with Wexner and Allen and the entire group, I feel that they got away with it because it was so mainstream in Chicago at the time. At the time, I remember walking into the new flight, especially during the summertime, and seeing underage boys, 12, 13, 14, and maybe even younger, just standing out in front of the bar, waiting to be picked up. You would see them outside of the bar, and then cars would drive up and pick the young boys up. It was normal. And they tried to normalize it all. And I remember there was an IHOP, and in front of the IHOP on the north side of Chicago, even during the winter, there were underage boys standing right on the corner being picked up. And it was just something that took place back then. You don't see it now, but you see it, you saw it then. So they tried normalizing everything, and as far as the individuals getting harmed or hurt or being rushed to the hospital, especially at the mafia parties and having the doctors at the parties, I believe that even that was all normalized at the time. Who would ever think to set up the mafia party during the 70s as a non-profit organization to penetrate young boys and men with their fists, and to incorporate that and to set it up as a non-profit? That alone just talks about how, just shows how in their mind they felt that it was just normal to even go in and do the paperwork for the mafia party in the late 70s and set it up as a non-profit. They felt that it was just a normal thing to do.
The normalization of depravity.
Yeah, so in their minds, they were so warped. And even for instance, the first night, the first experience when I was 12 with Alan and David, they had the rags ready. They knew that I would be bleeding. They had Lubriderm that night in different oils that they used. They had dildos, which I don't even remember if they used anything like that. It was like a vibrating little white thing. It wasn't little, it was big. But I was so out of it, whatever they gave me even that night, eventually, like I said, I fell asleep and woke up the following morning and said, is anything going to grow inside of me? But they were prepared. They had the rags knowing that, and the towels and everything knowing that I would be bleeding. Even Leslie, when he actually defecated shit all over me in the hotel room at the Hilton, to think that he had those sheets in the hotel room, the suite, that tells you that he had planned all this out. So they were planning on doing as far as, like, when you think of the blood, needing the towels to wipe the blood off, Leslie having the sheets ready to change the sheets on the bed after he shit all over me. So that tells me that they've done this throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, and they got away with it. And then during the early 80s, whatever happened, everyone moved out of Chicago.
Within a year, you said.
I remember whatever happened as far as the collection. Alan flew to Acapulco, and I'll never forget, he flew to Acapulco and came back with the pictures of Polaroid pictures of this beautiful place he had to buy right away to fly right back so that he could go there and stay. He thought he was going to stay permanently. He had organized individuals to handle the sale of the collection, which it does say that it was dismantled in the beginning of the 80s, correct? I think I sent you the documents. And he had individuals, which I thought was odd too, because for some reason the collection and all the Egyptian artifacts and all the bodies he had a lot of animals too, mummified animals and different mummified birds, and he was obsessed with cats and cats' heads and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So all of that was, sold off within no time at all. And it got to the point where I remember Leslie was trying to convince him to just donate the entire collection to the Art Institute of Chicago. But Alan did not want to donate the entire collection as one large collection. He wanted to break it up.
Yeah.
And
what did Alan talk? Sorry to interrupt there. Why did Alan say that? Why Alan wanted to?
They were all leaving. They were all retiring. They were all moving on. They'd had it with Chicago. They were all retired. They were constantly saying they're retiring, they got to go, and they got to go right away. They were all in a rush to get out of Chicago, sell everything and get out of Chicago.
And that was during 1983, 1984, you said.
Yeah, I would say up until 85 maybe. I don't exactly know the date, but the early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And but when I think of the mummies, which was a little creepy, and Juliet Bryant said the same thing because she remembers smelling something in New Mexico when Bill Clinton was there and Bill Richards. She remembers a strange smell, and
in the New Mexico buildings,
where Jeffrey Epstein's house in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And what's really odd is that the places would smell, and he would always blame it on the mummies. And they would take the mummies out, and they were gone for 30 days. And he would say they were on display at different museums throughout the country. And then the mummies would appear. And then within a couple of months, the same mummy would leave. And I'm like, when I look back on it all, they would use the same excuse that the mummies smell. And so it's good to get them out of the apartment for a while, and they would claim they were being sent to museums to be on display throughout the world. But they only took the mummies out. They didn't take the actual jewelry or anything except for when they had a big display, an exhibition at the Art Institute of all the Egyptian jewelry. Mm-hmm. At that point, they came in and took all the artwork, everything out. And the display was spectacular at the museum. They had an entire room set aside. Recently, I tried contacting the Art Institute of Chicago, and they sent me emails, and they refused to go into detail about anything to do with Leslie Wexner or Alan Kramer. Mm. And they had a very large room that was spectacular and it was set up for like 3 months, the exhibit of Alan Kramer's artwork.
When was the last time you talked to Juliet?
I communicate with Juliet through DMs, direct message.
Mm-hmm.
And the last time was like 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm.
Juliet is, okay, when it comes to the Epstein victims, I prefer to use the term victim. I know everyone wants to use the term survivor, but I use the term victim. And Maria Farmer and I had a conversation about the term survivor and victim. And at one point, Maria said the same thing. She said, I prefer to use the term victim. So when it comes to Juliet, a lot of the other victims, the Epstein victims, tried filling my head with negative information about the other victims. And then when I started listening to Juliet, I was like, wait, no. When Juliet talks about how they were threatened as far as planting drugs in people's apartments and having people arrested, that's exactly what Leslie Wexner and Alan Kramer told me during the 80s. So right then and there, when I saw Juliet mention that, I said, she is telling the exact truth, because that's what they did to me. And then when she started talking about the Bill Clinton incident in New Mexico and the smell, and then I thought of the smell of the mummies, if that's what it was. I was thinking, wait, that was odd, that smell. And she said something about a smell.
It's a very distinct smell, the smell of a corpse, of a human corpse. It's a different smell than the smell of an animal corpse. And
I have never I don't think I have. Unless that was the smell of the bodies, and who knows?
with the mummies, this sounds like what you smelled was the smell of the human corpse. And the question, obviously, that you're concerned about was, were you smelling the mummies? Was there something about the mummification process that in the heat you would smell the corpses? Or were you smelling a recent corpse?
A recent corpse that could have been in that case that they and I don't want to get into conspiracies, but was there an actual body in those mummy cases that they used the mummy cases as a way of getting the body out of the apartment?
It's a reasonable question. Those are questions that a reasonable individual experiencing a conscience investigating a crime or several crimes would ask. So I think that you're asking the right questions.
Yes, and with me, I try to stay in contact with the different people, and lately I realized that I'm not going to go back and forth with he said, she said. I personally blame a lot of the attorneys that were involved in the Epstein case as far as them operating a blackmail and extortion ring. Even when it comes to, I was there for the entire process, even with the J.P. Morgan case, and I witnessed exactly what took place behind the scenes. And believe me, I don't want to go into detail. It was absolute criminal.
Well, when our conversation the other day, from my experience, the mainstream media narrative regarding dates, 1991, dates individuals met, is a false narrative that there's
Yes, it is.
specific grains of truth, but it's like they arbitrarily chose what dates they thought would be convenient for them. Similar regarding some of the incidents Sasha had experienced with with Trump and then with Dr. Bornstein. From my experience, there was a lot of premeditation regarding media narratives they were trying to control politically.
Yes.
And that there were similar tactics regarding all those years with the parties on the farms, the related parties going back into the 1970s, even earlier, and that with the cases that they wanted the convenience of Epstein more as a scapegoat and a false focus on only Epstein, and an idea that the trafficking just all commenced suddenly during 1991, and as a run-of-the-mill attempt to avoid accountability and control media narratives to avoid accountability.
Yes, and even with recently, I noticed Maxwell in a couple of articles, she had stated that, through her attorneys, that there were individuals that actually wielded as far as secret payoffs with not only with mainly the attorneys, mainly to keep them out of trouble and to keep them unindicted by the federal authorities. Mm-hmm. Well, that did happen, and I've witnessed it, and I know exactly everything that happened behind the scene. And you had attorneys that threatened exposing individuals if they didn't turn over millions, and that did happen. And the victims, the survivors, a lot of them were extremely upset because they did not want to go along with what the attorneys wanted them to do. Mm-hmm. But yet the attorneys had blackmail material on a lot of the victims and the survivors, so they felt they had to go along with what the attorneys wanted. And I mean, when you look at the amount of money, just the J.P. Morgan settlement alone, the amount of money these attorneys actually received, it's unbelievable. Yeah. And there's only so much that I can say, but I know a lot behind the scenes that has happened. And eventually I will come forward, but it's just not the right time right now.
I understand. I'm going to pause the recording right now, and I'm just going to...
Okay.
Let me just